former Fulton County District Attorney and Sheriff.
Formerly a judge, and he knows a little bit about how these things go.
From Mohawk Valley, legal eagle, lawman.
He is the Sheriff of Fulton County, New York. Just such an amazing guy.
This is the Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.
How you doing? This is the Rich Giardino Show. I'm Rich Giardino. Today's guest is going to be Rick Collins. Rick is a partner in Collins, Gann, McCloskey, and Berry, and that's in Long Island, Garden City. And
it's right in Mineola, just outside Garden City.
Easy to find. Collins, Gann, and McDonald, and Berry. Rick was a former assistant DA in Nassau County. We know each other from that experience. I was an ADA. We were partners for a while down there. After Rick moved on, he's the past president of the Nassau County Bar Association. He's a Criminal Courts Bar Association president in Nassau County. He's been on the executive committee of the New York State Bar Association Criminal Justice Section. And he's the past chair of reentry and collateral consequences in committee in the American Bar Association. Rick has written extensively on steroids and other muscle-enhancing drugs. He's also testified before Congress. He has written a book called Legal Muscle, which you can Google online, and that explains. Has it been updated, Rick, or is it still the original book? Or are we?
It's the original book, but I wrote a bodybuilding magazine column on issues involving the fitness culture and law for almost 25 years. That was essentially an update and monthly continuation of that book, Legal Muscle, years ago.
And in addition, Rick tried one of the first cases involving steroids and substances and became a nationally sought out expert in the field, because at the time he started, there were not many lawyers who specialized or were familiar with the area. Rick also has been a weightlifter since college. He's been a law school professor and adjunct professor in the evenings, and he was in the movie Toxic Avenger and Toxic Avenger 2. So Google that.
Sure.
All three. And he played other roles in TV, and it's been a pleasure knowing him. We're good friends. So the disclosure is, and I don't want to hurt his reputation, but we are good friends. Sorry.
I admit it. I'm proud to admit it. And yes, we go way back. And like you, I've got some different perspectives on the criminal justice system. I've seen it from the perspective of the prosecutor, as you have as well. But I've also seen it from the position of the defense attorney. And, so I've seen kind of both sides of the aisle, the things that work in our criminal justice system, the things that don't work in our system. And it's become a hot topic, right? There's, especially here in New York, there's a lot of concern about, are we going in the right direction with some of our laws, whether it's bail reform or discovery reform or just drug policy in general. Are we doing the right thing to address the problem of drug addiction and the use of drugs in society, both in New York State and beyond?
Yeah. And one of the things that's affecting almost every state now is the immigrant situation across this country.
Yes.
It's literally illegal immigrants are not every illegal immigrant, but we have pockets of illegal immigrants bringing drugs, child trafficking with children. In New York State and across this country, a border officer cannot ask a child when they're with an adult, are you here of your own free will? They can only ask the adult if the child is related, which is really lame because we've had instance after instance. In fact, we've had over 100,000 deaths in the last 12 months of fentanyl overdoses. And the FBI director, Ray, who is President Biden's FBI director and the Homeland Security director, have both said that gangs and the cartel are infiltrating us from the southern border and to a smaller degree the northern border, but it's happening. So, Rick, let's get started with years ago, in 5-6 years ago, many of these states like Oregon, out west, they decided that they were going to, let's say, decriminalize harder drugs A lot of states decriminalize marijuana. So tell us the practical effect that you've seen by the decriminalization of drugs. And, we talk about what are more effective. How do we handle, because we know, you and I know that homelessness, mental health, and substance abuse are all tied in. And a lot of times the only treatment people get is when they're in a facility because they're away to drugs to an extent, although we've had
Right.
an overdose in our facility.
Yeah.
But so why don't you start and you tell us from your perspective, where are some of the issues that have created a worse environment and what can be done better?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great question. I think that's a question that we're asking in New York State, and we're asking it on a federal level and in many other states, is what does effective drug policy look like? How do we craft a controlled substance policy, a drugs of addiction policy that really works and makes sense, that's humane and compassionate, but also improves the law enforcement and health and safety of the community perspective as well. I guess one of the things to kind of start off with is I'd like to at least divide for the discussion steroids and performance and image enhancing drugs from narcotics and the more traditional drugs of abuse, because I think we might have different policies that would work with respect to one versus the other. But when it comes to what you're talking about, which is sort of hardcore narcotics, fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, the real drugs of abuse. I think that we started a war on drugs under President Nixon, and that sort of militaristic approach to drug use was something that kind of continued for some 40 years, right? Put them in jail, use the prison system, the criminal justice system to address the issue of drug addiction and drug abuse. And after 40 years, many in the law enforcement community now say, you know what, maybe that wasn't the most effective way of handling it. Maybe there were other ways we could have done it. We've criminalized a whole population, felonized people, preventing them from really working and maximizing their productivity after they serve time. And so we started rolling back a lot of those sort of drug war approaches to kind of take a more humane and compassionate approach to drug use and drug abuse. As a society, I think we tend to overcorrect problems. So we deal with some of the issues that, maybe we went too far. If you remember the Rockefeller drug laws, where like the smallest amount, the tiniest amount of a controlled substance, and you were looking at years in prison, maybe we went too far in our sort of militaristic approach to drug abuse, and you're certainly drug abuse and drug addiction fall under the umbrella of mental health and mental illness issues, right? It's in the DSM-5. It's a psychiatric, substance abuse disorder problem. So we've kind of gone in the other way. And as you allude to in cities, for example, like San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, we've completely reversed course, right? And so now we've enacted policies that in the idea of being compassionate and humane, we are now reaching a level of tolerance of drug abuse where if you listen to interviews of people who are living in tents in some of those cities, they will tell you that they're not from there, that they come from other states, because if you're a heroin addict and you love being a heroin addict, the place you want to be is San Francisco, because you live as well as anybody could possibly live without ever having to get off heroin. So that it's made easy. And you hear these interviews from people who say it's a wonderful thing to be a heroin addict here in San Francisco. I live in a tent, but I get all my food, I have clean needles. And so the question is, when you overcorrect a problem and go completely in the opposite direction, that ultimately creates even more problems.
Well, I will tell you, I was a drug treatment court judge, and that was one of the more satisfying parts of my career as a judge. And Janet Reno started it when she was a state's attorney in Florida, and then when she was the attorney general for Bill Clinton, and they promoted it as every community could do their own thing, and it was good in this sense. We were able to use the criminal justice system to break the cycle, give them intense treatment, said, look, you're going to jail or you're going inpatient. If they violated with a positive test or they didn't comply with their counselors, they were put in for a weekend or a week, and then they increased the level of treatment. Great program, great in theory. However, you needed a lot of resources to dedicate it to them.
Right.
What happened, unfortunately, in New York and across the country, we were using bail not to ensure their return to court. We were using bail as a coercive tool to get them into treatment, which was good. Everybody agreed we need them in treatment. It's a good thing to do because the reward, the carrot at the end was they would have a reduced charge or they wouldn't go to jail or prison. So it worked well when you had the resources. We have a small community without transportation a lot of times for people without licenses because we treated both drugs, alcohol, and a combination. So with the bail, what frustrates me is, and I've explained it time and time again to the legislators, I've explained it on national, local shows and state shows, that by taking the bail and making it no bail on B possession of drugs, B sale, and other crimes that are linked. And let me say this, you and I both know there's basically, when it comes to drugs and crime, there's two kinds. There's criminals who only do their crimes because they're addicted to something and they're trying to get more drugs, or they're so high they don't know what they're doing. And then there's those who are just criminals that like to party.
Right.
And I said that was always the problem with drug court, is deciding which ones are those who are drug addicts, who if you clean them up, they wouldn't commit crimes, and those who are criminals that like to, use drugs. And once they took away bail, we lost that option. And I say it hurts minority communities the most because they have a higher incidence of drug use and abuse. And the one thing is, when you and I were talking, when you go back to the incarceration rates, it's de facto, the laws impacted the minority communities greater for a variety of reasons. But one of them was a lot of the street sales were in African-American, Black, lower income communities, and easy targets for the police. And so when you get somebody with $40 worth of crack cocaine, let me close the window, it was so hot in here. When you get somebody.
Well, what you're saying, Judge, what you're saying,
yeah,
I mean, it makes perfect sense. And, but you need a carrot and a stick approach, right? So the carrots are great, so rewarding people and giving them the carrots is fine. But when you forget the stick, when you take away the consequences of not following through with drug treatment, you've got no leverage. You lose all leverage. And whether that's through bail or through maybe signing documents early on so that it's not actually bail, it's simply a condition of, the maybe a plea condition, and then you reverse the plea later on or vacate the plea. There are different mechanisms to do it because you're right. Bail technically is just to ensure somebody's return to court. So it can't really ideologically be used for these other purposes of either sort of protecting the public or forcing somebody into treatment. It's really, will you come back to court is really the essence of it. But there are other ways of doing that. But when you look at even countries like Portugal, where as sort of the model of humane treatment of drug addiction, Portugal decriminalized the possession of all drugs, heroin, all of those same drugs, similar to what some Oregon did a few years ago, except that Portugal kept in effect the sort of strong carrots, strong leverage to drive people into treatment. In cities like San Francisco, you're really lacking that. You're really reaching a point where it's simply throwing up your hands in drug tolerance. And if you read a book like San Francisco by Michael Schellenberger or others who've really examined that problem, you see that those are not effective policies. You really need to have some coercion of treatment. And you'll hear this is an ideological difference that I hear some people say is, well, you can't force people into treatment. You can't force them to help themselves. And that's a position I beg to differ with that. I think you must force them, because if a person is addicted to heroin, they don't want to come off the heroin. right? And is that really their free will, or is it really the heroin that is driving them through the addiction to it to make these irrational choices? And so if you walk up to a person who's living in a tent on a street somewhere, and you say, listen, I've got this nice, warm, safe indoor bed with air conditioning, and if you get in this van, we're going to bring you there, but you're never going to get any more heroin. We're going to take that away from you. That person's taking off and running in the opposite direction as quickly as possible. So if you don't have some element of coercion at that point, the system's never going to work.
Rick, let me just interrupt for a minute, because this is the Rich Giardino Show. We're on Apple, X, Spotify, YouTube. Our guest today is Rick Collins. Rick is a former prosecutor. He's currently a defense attorney. He served in a variety of positions of leadership in the Nassau County Bar Association in Long Island and the State Bar Association. He's been involved in a committee on reentry. Reentry is when people leave jail or prison and go back into the community. We're having an interesting discussion today. But Rick, how can people read more of your articles? Do you have a website for the firm? Rick is a partner in Collins, Gann, and McDonald, and let's see, who's the other one?
Collins, so it's Collins, yeah. So it used to be Collins, McDonald, and Gann, and that's how far you and I go back as friends, back to the 80s. But the firm, we brought in two partners. It's Collins, Gann, McCloskey, and Barry. We're in Mineola, New York. My website is rickcollins.com. I'm easy to find. I'm active on social media. If you want to follow me on Instagram, it's Rick Collins ESQ. And I try to post things that are in the sphere of law and policy, particularly criminal justice issues. As we said before, a lot of my drug cases, and I've handled a lot of drug cases, both as a prosecutor and a criminal defense lawyer, drug cases of all types, heroin cases, methamphetamine cases. A lot of my cases now is in the area of law of anabolic steroids and performance drugs. And I've probably handled more cases involving these sorts of performance and image enhancing drugs like steroids and growth hormone and peptides and selective androgen receptor modulators and all these long words that most people wouldn't really know too much about, because most lawyers, even criminal defense lawyers, don't deal with them. And yes, I've had a nationwide practice. I'm probably the only lawyer that really has extensive experience in that particular area. A few years ago, I was part of a working group of the U.S. Sentencing Commission to recalculate and recalibrate the steroid sentencing federal guidelines. So I'm very familiar with that area. I've represented a lot of bodybuilders and fitness enthusiasts and people involved in the steroid trade. And so that's certainly something that we can talk about. But to sort of finish up with the discussion on what to do about narcotic addiction and criminal justice issues, I do think there has to be some amount of coercion in order to get people who are under the throes of addiction to get into the type of facility where they can get help. And one of the problems is, as you know, when you mentioned resources before, we just don't have them anymore in this state and many states, right? And if you go back, there's a reason. If you go back, you'll remember this. Many years ago, Geraldo Rivera did an expose on a state psychiatric facility in Staten Island named Willowbrook. And he got in with cameras. And what he showed the public of what was going on in Willowbrook was so horrific. And we're talking every imaginable human abuse was going on within the walls of this state psychiatric facility, that when the public saw it, they said, this is intolerable. We need to shut these state facilities need to be shut down. And so that's what we did.
Yeah, and the homeless crisis skyrocketed. I always use the same example you just mentioned to explain to people one of the few policy issues that both Republicans and Democrats agreed on was we have to empty out the mental health facilities because they're so brutal. So the Democrats all wanted to be humane and do it. The Republicans wanted to save money. Right. So they did it, and everything skyrocketed. Homelessness under Mario Cuomo skyrocketed in New York and across the country when they started letting when they started releasing people without alternatives. And there's very few houses now, halfway houses and things to treat. But I
Right.
want to ask you, I want to talk a little bit more about the steroids and anabolic, whatever you call them. But one of the most frustrating things for me as a sheriff and when I was a judge and a DA is having parents come to me with tears in their eyes, whether it's their 17-year-old daughter, whether it's their 26 or 35-year-old son who's addicted to drugs, heroin, cocaine. They can't crack, they can't get off it, and the system can't help them. I get a 17-year-old now, well, they're possessing drugs at 17, nothing's going to happen. They're going to go to probation. They're going to say, stay out of trouble. We can't do what we used to be able to do, right or wrong, like you said. And so it's like, it's interesting because I would argue that it's consequences and it's coercion and consequences together because there's not as many consequences as there used to be for your bad conduct. So what do I tell a mother who calls me and says, my 17-year-old daughter, legal age, is living with a 24-year-old drug addict who's got her high on drugs. You guys can't do anything because every time you go over there, he says everything's fine. How do we help those? How do we help parents? I've had kids who are on drug court die of drug overdoses, die of combination of things. And it's sad because, as you know, a lot of these people have a tremendous amount of talent. It's just never been brought out, and they don't even realize their self-worth of what they have to offer. So what do I tell, or what would you tell a parent, when they feel that, like, they get frustrated. They think I'm not trying to help them or you're not helping me. And
Right.
it's like, we can't do a lot of things we might have been able to do in the past. So how do you address those issues?
Yeah, so I think a lot of our policy for people who either have whatever, whether it's substance abuse, addiction to substances, or various mental illnesses and different types of mental disorders, is that we've essentially prioritized their constitutional rights. In other words, their right to make their own choices. And so you can't just involuntarily grab somebody and say, you know what, this poor girl is addicted to drugs. She's living with a drug dealer. We're just going to scoop her up against her will, and we're going to put her into a treatment facility for 6 or 9 months against her will. But by the end of that, she'll be grateful, right? At the end of that, she'll be clean. Maybe in a perfect world that should be allowed, but we're not allowed to do that. And so our laws effectively protect a person from that happening. So unless you're an imminent threat to yourself or others, and we see that play out on the streets of Manhattan and in the subways. So the person who's talking to themselves in the subway, on the subway track, and looking around and talking to imaginary people, there's no ability to grab that person and put them involuntarily into a facility until they actually push somebody onto the tracks. So,
because they have to, like you said, so our listeners understand, it's got to be an immediate threat to themselves. They're trying to hurt themselves or someone else. So being what they would say, they're crazy, look in their eyes. They said crazy stuff. Well, it's got to be an immediate threat. I want you to tell us a little bit about the difference. Like where I live, there are a lot of young work, muscle heads, we call them. Some of them use steroids, others use, all kinds of these things they get at the health store. What is
Right.
legal? What's not legal? And from your experience, not only as a lawyer, but as a lifter and having been involved in this, what is safe for the young people to take that's not going to affect their bodies later on, and what's legal?
Right. So there's a lot there. So let me start by saying I went into private practice in 1990. And by coincidence, that was the same year that the US Congress took anabolic steroids, which is a class of drugs that is essentially synthetic variations of the male hormone testosterone, and which build muscle and virilize, and took those drugs and put them into the same federal law with heroin and cocaine and crack and methamphetamine, the Controlled Substances Act, and made them a Schedule III drug. So that happened in 1990. Most states, including New York State, New York is the only state that actually classifies anabolic steroids as a Schedule II drug instead of a Schedule III drug. But scheduled drug means essentially that it can't be prescribed for anything other than a medical purpose. And there's all sorts of red tape and restrictions on doctors and pharmacists that would, prevent people from using it for non-medical purposes. And so the main reason that Congress did that was really not because there was an epidemic of people dying in the streets from anabolic steroid use. It was really because there were reports that athletes were using it in sports to cheat and to get an unfair advantage over others, because these drugs can make people bigger, stronger, or faster, and those things can be helpful in certain sports. And so because of that sort of sports cheating issue, steroids were criminalized. Doesn't mean that they don't have negative side effects. Obviously, every drug can be dangerous. You take, a bottle of aspirin and chug it down, you're not waking up, right? So certainly steroids can have long-term and some short-term negative effects. But whether steroids belonged in that criminal justice mode as a controlled substance is debatable. Interestingly, the FDA, the DEA, the American Medical Association, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse all testified before Congress, don't do it. They don't belong there. These are not used for psychological effects, and they don't have the same addictive aspects. It was the San Francisco DA many years ago who once said, nobody ever knocked over a liquor store for anabolic steroids, right? Nobody's laying on the streets with a needle in their arm. Nobody is, robbing banks. It's all of the drive-by shootings and gang violence that occur in urban areas. None of that is about steroids, right? It's a very different type of thing. But there is an athletic cheating, and certainly you don't want, as you said, young people using them. And the risks are higher for younger people than they are for older people. So absolutely, steroids not for young people. It's a crime federally and in the state. It's a felony to sell steroids or give them to somebody for a non-medical purpose if you're not a physician or there's a medical purpose involved. And even the possession of even any amount of an anabolic steroid without a doctor's prescription for a lawful medical purpose is a crime, both federally and in New York State. So younger athletes, in terms of what they should be doing, certainly, having been a bodybuilder myself, and I competed as a bodybuilder many years ago, and I still consider myself a bodybuilder. I spend 5 days, a week in the gym still. I still push as much weight as an old man can push, and it's not terrible.
So I still spend 7 days in the diners.
Well,
So
that's it.
restaurants. So we both continued on our course and have now
We
the
have.
age.
But I would recommend whey protein. I don't know if you use a whey protein. Whey
They have
protein
that,
is just it's a great way of sort of improving the macronutrient ratio in your diet to get more protein. Protein is great for building muscles, so you definitely want to get enough of that if you're a young teen athlete or an athlete of any age, even an older athlete, definitely good. Another thing is a vitamin product, a supplement product called creatine monohydrate. I don't know if
Creatine
you've
we've
heard
heard
of
a
it.
lot of.
So it's a natural, it's present in meat. It's a naturally occurring chemical that's common in the foods that we eat. And studies show that it can improve both athletic performance and body composition in people of all ages. There's a persuasive research position paper that came out that I was part of, actually, that looked at all the evidence and found that it is safe for teens. And also, they've done some studies with older people and found that even in geriatric populations, there's a benefit to creatine. There are some who say if you're, it's a great thing to be giving a little bit of creatine powder in the coffee to your mom or your dad at a certain age. So those are the things that I would recommend. I'm a vitamin guy. I do take a lot of vitamins. I represent a lot of sports nutrition companies as well. Most of my practice, a lot of my practice now is kind of where sports and nutrition and training and bodybuilding intersect with law and regulation. So I do represent sports nutrition companies. I think that I represented Sylvester Stallone's nutrition company at one time, and I've spent a few occasions. I've spent meeting and spending some time with former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I've enjoyed meeting and spending. I once spent a whole afternoon with him in his office in Santa Monica, which was as a kid who grew up in the 70s and idolized, Mr. Olympia Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was phenomenal. The first time I ever met him was in 2002 at a bodybuilding contest. And I was so nervous. My hands were sweating. This was my idol as a teenager. And we introduced in a back room in a private meeting, which was so cool. And he walks up and suddenly I see him. It's larger than life. And I'm staring at this guy and I can't believe it. And somebody walks up and says, Arnold Schwarzenegger, this is Rick Collins. And he puts his hand out, and I've done an impression of him through the years.
I know, I was going to ask you to do that.
And, somehow it bubbled out. And I actually, as he put out his hand, I put out my hand and I said, "It's super fantastic to meet you." And he looked at me, his eyes got wide. And for a minute, I thought, oh my God, is he going to hit me? Or is he going to terminate me? And he looked and he said, "You do an impression of me." I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "It's super fantastic." And so, he got a kick out of it, luckily. But yeah, I love my practice. I have somewhat of a national practice. I handle these types of cases all over the country. I do athletic doping cases also. I represented a boxer on a boxing match, doping accusation in Dusseldorf, Germany. I've given lectures all over the world, including mainland China and Thailand. So yeah, I love what I do. And I've gotten to see a lot of the drug policies in places all around the world. I should mention, when we talk about anabolic steroids and the classification in the United States, in Canada and in the United Kingdom, steroids are not a controlled substance. The possession of a personal use amount is not an arrestable offense. And yet I don't see in those countries some sort of epidemic of deaths or crime or any other issues. Most of the people using anabolic steroids, contrary to what you'd think by why the law was enacted, are not cheating athletes. The overwhelming majority of people who are using non-medical steroids are people who they're mostly men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, not teenagers, not competitive athletes, but guys who are simply looking to look bigger in a tight t-shirt. It's essentially the equivalent of, Botox, liposuction, breast augmentation, or other things that women may do to sit for vanity's purposes and not much else.
Rick, I'd love you to come back and talk more about other criminal justice issues. There's so many, and you're right. There's so many issues, and once we start talking about them, we both have seen so much. And just wrapping it up, give us again where they can follow you at, so that the listeners know how they can follow Rick Collins at, and then we'll wrap up. But give them how to locate you, where to find you first.
Sure. So I'm easy to find online. So you can find me at rickcollins.com. Easy to remember, Rick Collins, since it's my name. But I also have a site that, if you're interested in this sort of steroid stuff, I've got a site at steroidlaw.com. Steroidlaw.com has some further information to kind of follow up on what we've talked about there. And I do post a lot on Instagram, probably more than some of the other social media sites. So at Rick Collins ESQ, like ESQ for lawyer, Rick Collins ESQ at Instagram is a great way to find me. You can reach me through the website if you ever had. My firm does things other than sort of my niche. We do bread and butter criminal defense through New York State. We also do personal injury matters. So we have a partner who does exclusively personal injury, negligence cases, somebody who's hurt, car accident, fallen down at somebody based on somebody else's negligence. We do a lot of those cases, so feel free to call. I appreciate you having me on the show. I always love spending time with you. I have to come visit you someday again up in.
I want you guys to come on up. Yeah, we were ADAs together. We had a lot of trials and we had a lot of fun when we were kids. And
we certainly
Rick,
did.
I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I'm going to have you back. When I bring you back, I want to start with roid rage, because we didn't discuss that. And then some other topics. This is Rich Giardino. This is the Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet. And we had an excellent guest, Rick Collins. Collins, I want to say Collins, McDonald, and Gann still. So you'll
it-
find
it-
them as we'll have it posted on our websites as to how to find you. And when we put it out, probably on a Thursday night, a couple of weeks, when we put it out, we'll get a hold of you ahead of time. We'll give you the links so you can post them on your sites. And like I say, we're on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. It's an interesting thing, Rick, because before I did this, I didn't understand that it didn't cost you anything to subscribe, so I would never go to a podcast. Now that I know it's free, I'm encouraging everyone to go out, and nobody wants to watch. And I told the local newsman, I said after my first episode, I got a call from a national or a local organization in the Adirondacks. I said they wanted to give me an award. He goes, one podcast? And I says, yeah. They said it's the Insomniacs Association of the Adirondacks. I said I'm the best natural cure for insomnia. So,
well, hopefully we
things-
kept them at least a little awake in this one.
Well, it's interesting. There's so many topics when you talk about criminal justice and how everything intersects, the mental health, like you said, the substance abuse. I really appreciate it. We'll get you the links. And again, our guest has been Rick Collins, attorney at law, and he's been on all kinds of committees. He's been the president of the Nassau County Bar Association. He's been in charge of the chair for defense on New York State Bar Association, several committees. He has written extensively, and he's testified before Congress and other places. Fortunately, he's never testified against me before a grand jury, which is lucky for me. Anyways, thanks an awful lot, Rick.
Thank you.
Like and subscribe to The Rich Giardino Show, part of the Elite Influencer Network, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time on The Rich Giardino Show, where the Constitution, crime, and politics meet.